life, people lie. I mean, directly in your face, but you don't know if they're lying or not. But in fiction, there is an implicit, I don't know, contract, implicitly, that I'm gonna lie to you, but in a, in good regards.
Mm-hmm.
So fiction always gives you hope and gives you like the right picture. Because in the start, there is a contract that I'm gonna lie to you. I believe in the color edge. There's a principle in color edge. He says the suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
You need to
Sure.
to forget all about your prejudices and
Mm-hmm.
right, or your project and prejudice, anything that you think before, and just accept the text as it is.
Yeah.
I like my references like Italo Calvino and Eco,
Umberto?
Eco.
Oh, Eco.
Both like
Yeah. So if you are reading, and so let's say your sources are novels, right? And you obviously read them carefully to show sort of what they invite us to feel and how we as a reader are impacted. Do you make an argument then that that tells us something about the world in which those novels circulate?
Yeah.
Okay. Like you would say, basically explain something to us about the worldview or the ideology of the people who read the novels, right? So you make an assumption that what you see and what the other people who read it see are, they're legible to each other. This is what I see in the novel, and I think this is what most readers are seeing. And the readers themselves then share or are helping to produce at least a certain ideology or worldview, right?
Of course, that reading is like a unique experience, but it's in uniqueness it's shared. Every reading a book, it's unique, but every reader and it says he's himself in the book.
Right, right.
That's the beauty.
Now you're using beautiful literary examples, and I'm going to take us down to a very non-literary one, but does anybody here, do you guys read or did you watch the Hunger Game movies? Is this circulating around just you? Anybody else? No? You watched it, okay, confess, there we go, okay. The reason I'm asking is because these novels, which are young adult novels, and then become major blockbuster movies in the US, this is Jennifer Lawrence is the star, and she's a big star. And I didn't know how much they'd circulated out beyond, because they seem to me to be very oddly American. But one of the things I think you can say, and if any of you want to go, I don't even know if I can recommend it. They're very strange books, and even stranger movies. But the thing that you can say is that this novel, these series of novels, could not have been written 30 years ago. They just wouldn't make any sense. Like girls and boys who are thrown into a ring where they're supposed to compete against each other and kill each other on national TV in order to make everybody feel better about the ruling power. Nothing about that makes sense except in a particular moment, it seems to me, in the US, where the idea of young people as fodder, and this is my interpretation of Hunger Games, young people as fodder for neoliberalism gone wrong makes sense, and even for people who've never heard of neoliberalism, but like the idea that the culture is eating up its young people and doing so on television for display in order to justify the ruling power just makes sense in the US now. It makes sense that that could be a $5 bazillion movie in a way that it couldn't have in some earlier period. And so you read the novels, and they were very, very popular novels before they were movies, and you assume that this tells you something about the culture that consumes it, and you unpack that. So the novels equal a kind of almost direct window into the ideology of at least part of a culture. So maybe not everybody, but some part of a culture. There are problems with that, right, in the sense that we don't always know that people read the books in the way that we might read them. They might read them they might read them differently. They might read books in different historical circumstances and something else happens. But that is one of the things that literary people try to do, use the sources as a kind of opening into ideology. Now, this is very different than what some of you who are doing more empirical studies of ideology or empirical studies of how people live do. I'm not saying yours isn't empirical because you're actually looking at the literature, but I mean by empirical, I mean what happens when you go out and survey people or talk to them about what they're doing. I'm going to turn back to you again for a second. Like, what method are you using to try to understand social movements, young people's movements? Literally, what are your sources? How do you find them? Okay.
I try to talk with activists from the movement and outside the movement and try to then ask them to describe exactly what are the practices, how did they go about doing what they do generally, and most point out like how do they decide to go to protest, what do they do in a protest, what are the practices that they do basically. But not necessarily restricted to protest movements or the act of protest, but also cultural and artistic endeavors, such as there's comic books, underground rap scene, slam concerts.
Which you go to, or
That's
the dream?
objective.
Yeah.
But I would have wished to observe these kinds of endeavors that are not seen as everyday life practices.
Right.
Not necessarily fit under the umbrella of every.
Or even of art, although they are.
Yeah.
So she's talking about doing, are we okay? Am I okay to keep doing this? Okay. So you're talking about doing unstructured interviews. Now, because you're brave, I'm going to ask everybody to help me with this. So what are the limits of using interviews? What are the problems? We know the usefulness. You get real people's voices. You're talking to them on what they do. You're on the ground. So can we talk about what some of the problems are of using interviews to try to get, do you use interviews on them?
Yeah, but to make it more complicated, I use a longitudinal approach, which means that I spent 6 years seeing people on a regular basis at different moments of their lives. Because, they can size their interview, their life stories and so on, and of course the context can be different. So when you have when you can, you have the opportunity to see people on a regular basis, it gives you a lot of information.
So are you doing more like ethnographic hanging out with people? Or are you doing structured interviews on a longitudinal basis every 2 years or every both? Okay. And what do you see the usefulness and the limits of that approach are?
As I say, the limits of interviews are the fact that people invent their own biographies sometimes, and they also adapt, especially it depends actually, but of course, when you interview leaders of parties, they have a tendency to have a pre-constructed discourse that they serve to each scholar they meet. And so that may be interview, maybe that may be a limit of doing only interviews. And I think also, of course, you need the broader context and you need the broader environment, and that's what ethnography is for. And you need also to compare. I mean, again, it depends on your topic and the population and your corpus. Again, confronting various sources, various and it's quite useful to get a broad picture of the situation.
And what about the you-ness of you doing the interview?
The you-ness of me, you have to explain.
So when I worked on this evangelicals, I grew up as a Southern Baptist. And so one thing, there's a joke among Southerners that Southerners can never make a point, they always have to tell a story. So here's a story of an interview I did with an African-American pastor in Boston which is an example of both why I think interviews can be really useful, and also how much about that interview was so much about him and me, the me-ness of me and him as him.
You mean literal axology, Weberian literal axology, this kind of thing?
The ways in which we interacted based on who he thought I was, or how he understood me.
Yeah, of course, that's quite important. And sometimes it's interesting because sometimes according to different academic traditions, for example, if you're a Muslim, working on Muslims in Europe, you will be asked to justify your position, or you'll be asked to tell a bit more about how you deal with the support, or the assumed familiarity with your topic and so on. And
They'll ask you to deal with what?
with the familiarity,
Uh-huh.
how familiar you are with your population and so on. Whereas this is not something that will be asked to a Christian working on Christian.
Yeah.
So it depends on the context as well, and it depends on how you.
And so the Muslims will ask you, who you're interviewing will ask you the scholarship.
Tradition.
Yeah.
Western academic tradition.
Yeah.
And I believe that there's also, I mean, that's something that should be taken into account as well. Yeah, how you, the fact that they assume that you may be familiar with the topic and the people you, and the faith of the people you're interviewing and so on, may have played a role in your, or may have influenced your analysis. And I have seen that a bunch of academics who have felt obliged to introduce a chapter or to draft a chapter in their introduction on, yes, I'm Muslim and this is how it's interplays in my role council. And this is influenced by the demands of the dominant academic tradition. So,
In the U.S. too, I mean, anybody, especially in religious studies, you have to,
yeah.
narrate yourself. So the thing that struck me about interviewing this guy, Reverend Bell, is that, all right, immediately there are all sorts of things going on when I go to interview him. First, he's black, I'm white. So here's the nice white lady from Washington, D.C., showing up in his church in Boston, which is a lower income church. He's a small church of people who don't have a lot of money. But he's gone to South Sudan. That's why I'm interviewing him. He's gone to South Sudan to redeem slaves in a very, highly complicated set of activities. So I think that in between us, and it's pretty clear if you read the book, I think that this is an appalling thing that they've done. It plays into a lot of ideas about Islam in the U.S. It's run by total right-wingers on the U.S. side. This is not who he is. He doesn't even know that, but that's what the case is. But at the same time, I want to understand him, and I want him to explain to me what he's done. Now, one of the great things about interviewing pastors, or the bad thing is, if you've ever done interviews with so one of my friends works on African-American musicians, and she goes and interviews people about this musician she wrote a biography on, and people say, oh, yeah, this musician you're asking about, she was nice. Can you tell me anything else about her? She was good. She was a good guitar player. She's just desperately trying to get people to say anything. If you interview pastors, you ask a question, 2 hours later they stop talking, right? They love to talk. They're good talkers, but every single time when I did work with evangelicals and interviewed evangelicals, they want to know who I am and what's my story. What do I think of them? Am I going to be condescending? Do I think that they're idiots? It's always there. So he doesn't ask me directly. A lot of people ask me directly, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? And would it be okay if I prayed for you? These are questions I'm used to. But he's not asking me this directly. But he's checking things out, and he says, now, what church did you grow up in? So he already thinks I'm Christian. He's right, I grew up in a church. And he wants to know, how can I file you? So I told him I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, which in the U.S. perspective, I'm saying I grew up in the most racist church there is. That's what I grew up in, straight out. And he said, oh, so okay, he's taking that, and he's a Southerner, too. And he said, oh, so you're a Southerner. So he's trying to make a nice Like, he knows, we both know, I've just told him I grew up in a racist church, and he's like, well, trying to make a nice connection. So then he starts joking with me. He says, he's talking about something, he says, I come from, those kind of folks who are going to church on Sunday, but they got a fifth of Jack Daniels underneath the truck wheels, right? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, and I'm laughing so hard. Like, I know exactly what he's talking about. He knows I know, and from then on, we're okay. I've laughed at the right joke. And having grown up as an evangelical helped me over and over again in those situations. And it put me in incredibly complicated and awkward position vis-a-vis how I narrate people later or how I talk about them later. And so to me, when you do interviews, like, it's one thing to go and look in the archives, and there are all sorts of limits to archival stuff, right? You can't ask any further questions of the people who filled out these forms about why they wanted to be short-term missionaries. That's all I've got, and I have to make a lot of assumptions. But I think one of the things about interviews is that you can't abstract, nor should you abstract the fact that there are two individuals or three or four who have real embodied presence to each other. So I'm not so interested in, like, I get it, like, people are always asking you prove that you have a proper objectivity, but no matter who you are, who goes into that, there's all sorts of going back and forth that make the interview what it is. The fact that you're there for a long time might change it too, right?
Yeah, you don't know what you want to do of it. I mean, for example, will your pastor in some way waiting for you to be an advocate for his cause?
This pastor, yeah, I don't know. I hope not.
Maybe you know that, because we also have to be clear and knowledgeable about it. That's something I have experienced many times doing interviews with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. So that's something you have to manage also the expectations of the people. If you are okay with this kind of family identification, we have also to be, we are totally disconnected from transnationalism, but it's something we have to be aware of. The fact that people do not give their time and also jump into this family identification for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They have also expectations.
Right, and actually, I don't think we're so far from transnationalism in the sense that certain kinds of I think that doing those kinds of interviews and locating yourself in an area for a long time, and these people might be transnational actors, but it does push you to think local or to some extent national as the context for the interviews that you're doing. It seems to me that you can't decontextualize very well at all when you're in those kind of very local contexts. So you can then ask, what meetings do they go to? Who else do they talk to? But it is a different kind of localization. You missed, we talked about South Sudan. We'll talk about it later. Who works in archival documents? Anybody? Not really? You probably do some archival work, or are they open to you, archival documents? No.